Hello, welcome to Ask Them Anything. I'm Mandi from Hummingbird, and I'm here today with Renee and Marion from Kompost Kids. They are a local nonprofit dedicated to all things composting. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks
Hey.
for having us. Super fun.
All right, so last week we asked you what you wanted to know about composting, and today we're providing you with the answers. This is going to be the first of two videos. So in this segment, we're going to answer your questions about the different ways you can compost at home. And in the second, we're going to talk about the questions that you had that were more about the details of maintaining a compost and a couple questions about composting services that came up. But before we jump in, before jumping into the questions that were submitted, Renee and Marion, can you tell us why composting is important? Why should we be doing this?
Marion, do you want to start?
Sure. There's a few different reasons that people choose to do composting, and it kind of falls into two categories. The first category is that people are gardeners, and compost is a wonderful addition to a community garden or a home garden. It adds nutrients to the soil and improves the quality of soil. So at some point, you're probably going to hear us refer to humus, and we don't mean the chickpea kind. It's the end product of a composting process where you get like a loose, airy soil material that's rich with micronutrients and also is alive. So it has a lot of the living bacteria that's a part of soil and helps vegetables and other plants grow and thrive. But it's not the only reason that people choose to compost. So even if you aren't a gardener, there's a significant sustainability reason to compost, whether you're doing it at home or participating in a municipal composting program or using a community compost site. Food waste in particular is a huge part of what we refer to as our waste stream. That's all of the municipal solid waste, which is home trash. So there's a lot of data about this, but the short pieces of information that are useful are that most people produce about 4.5 pounds of food waste per day, which is a lot. And food waste is about 15% of that municipal solid waste stream. Once it makes its way to a landfill, it becomes methane, which is a greenhouse gas. So the process of it breaking down in a landfill is actually a greenhouse process. It's contributing to climate change. And there's no reason not to recycle food waste. It's something that you can do at home. It's the most democratic form of recycling. So any person that has a space to do it can compost. So we kind of feel like it's a place where individuals can make a real impact. So that's kind of the short.
And just to jump in there, we have also on our website, which I'm sure Mandi will share, compostkids.org, there's a tab called MKE No Waste. And we've also put up more stats on there if you're interested in learning more about how much methane is produced or how much food waste or how large our landfills are in Milwaukee. So we have lots of stats on there.
Awesome, cool. And you all know I'm up for building a sustainable Milwaukee, so let's compost. Yeah. Okay, so let's jump in to the questions that were submitted. So again, these are going to be kind of all based on composting at home. But to start, let's make sure we're all on the same page. So can you touch on the difference between backyard and commercial composting?
So that's a great question. Thanks. And again, we have tons of resources, so we're probably not going to be able to cover a ton of it. But in the short, backyard composting is what is safe to do in your own backyard. So it is limited. What we like to say is keep it vegan plus eggshells. So that's about the max of what you'd want to put in your backyard. So no dairy, no animal products, no fats and oils. And then when you do that in your own space, you want to have a ratio of food scraps of 1 and then twice as much brown material, which we use wood chips in our backyard composting, but there's lots of other types of brown material that you can add. And then commercial composting happens at an industrial scale. So that is a much larger process. They can handle things like pet waste or the zoo waste, not necessarily domesticated pet waste, but for example, Blue Ribbon Organics can take the zoo waste or meat and dairy and bones. And that's because it's happening at a much larger scale. It gets much warmer and they are testing the process all the way throughout. Anything to add, Marion?
That is true. So one of the key things with commercial composting is that testing process. So even small scale commercial processes use a way to measure the temperature within a compost pile. So without getting too far into the biology of it, it gets really hot in a compost pile, and that actually has the ability to kill pathogens. So the thing about composting is that across the board, there is an end product that ends up back out in either a community garden, a home garden, or a commercial application. And that product has to be safe. So commercial composting is able to take in the waste products that might have pathogens in them and process it safely. So that's a really important point, and probably the major distinction that we would make. So.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. Because, yeah, I know commercial composting can take a few extra things. But again, we're going to be talking about backyard composting today. So, first question that came in was, how do you start a successful backyard compost? What should we be considering in terms of air circulation, sun exposure, and layering when building a pile?
I want to just sort of preface this by saying that I think with home composting, there's two approaches to it. You can do a cold or a hot method, but the basic fact of organic waste is that it is predisposed to decompose, which I'm not trying to be punny, but that you could theoretically just pile it all in the back and in a spot that is appropriate and, like safe for it to be, and it will eventually break down, and people do that, and it is one way to do it. There are some disadvantages, but at the end of the day, like, your food waste is going to break down, and you can encourage it to go faster or slower. There are ways to mitigate pests, there were a few questions about that, but it is possible to seriously overthink this too, and I want people to not feel intimidated by the process. It is literally going to happen whether you do anything or not. So with backyard composting, you're choosing to do it in a way that's like effective and safe, as opposed, or not producing greenhouse gases. But don't overthink it. It's going to be fine. So let's start with that. So,
and we do have resources on our website about what a bin system could look like if you wanted to build a large thing, and lots of things about how to consider what you should put in and what you should not put in. But one thing that Marion was just talking about is key is know where you want to put it and how you want to take care of it. How much time and effort do you want to spend working on it? If you have the ability to pit compost, unfortunately in the city, it's really hard to do, but it's possible. And I'm going to try to do some in my own backyard and take some pictures, and show what that would look like. But the key is keeping it safe, and also minimizing what might want to dig in there. So, go ahead.
Great.
So I guess the first question you should ask yourself is, like, where do I want to put my compost pile? And there's two pieces of information. One is that you want it to be accessible. So you need to be able to get at it, to add material to it, and also to do maintenance on it. So that could lead you to put it directly outside of your back door. It could lead you to put it someplace else in your yard. But it needs to be accessible because you are going to need to be able to maintain it, regardless of what method you're choosing. So that's the first question you want to answer. And then the second question you want to answer is, how much effort do I want to put into this? Because that question will then partly help you decide where to put it, but also what type of container you're going to use, and how much you're going to be wanting to access it, that kind of thing. So you can go kind of the almost no effort route, which is the Darth Vader head bins, which it's the helmet. It looks like a Darth Vader helmet, to a hot composting process where you would want to have multiple containers and you'd be moving material around on a weekly or sometimes more frequent basis. But I think we tend to recommend the cold process for beginner home composters, because it is low effort, and because it doesn't take up a lot of space in your yard, and it's relatively simple. So that would be kind of the first question, is where are you going to put it in your yard? Compost bins do want to be in a sunnier location, but it doesn't have to be. And another thing to keep in mind is that they do need a certain amount of wetness. So whether or not you're covering it is a decision that you'll have to sort of think through unless you're going to add water to the system. So if you put a lid on it, which is advisable, then you would have to add water at a few different points. So
great. And when it comes to adding the materials, is layering an important piece?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, it is key to have the mix of your food scraps and then what we call our brown source. So as I mentioned, wood chips are great if you have sawdust at home, shredded paper, your leaf pile, like you can kind of keep it off to the side. If you're dumping a bucket of food scraps in there, and like we said, in your backyard, keep it vegan, cover that with twice as much of the brown source. So if you have dead leaves that you saved over from the winter before, one bucket of food scraps, 2 buckets of the leaves, and you're good to go. So, and you can actually see pictures of this online. Some people call it lasagna composting, and they'll literally have like a full, like inch of food and then almost a little bit thicker layer of leaves on top of that. It doesn't always work out that way, but yeah, it's pretty good. It's good to keep that ratio at least 2 to 1.
Renee, do you want to back up and just explain a little bit more about what brown source would be, what brown is?
You can.
Okay, or I can. Yeah. So Renee touched on this a little bit, but there's 2 key components to a healthy compost system, and we tend to refer to them as greens and browns. So greens are typically the food scraps that you're contributing, although it could also be vegetative matter from your garden as you're working in it. And you'll also hear us refer to that as nitrogen. So composting is at its most fundamental a ratio that you're trying to create of nitrogen to carbon. So the other piece of that is the brown material, which is dried leaves, paper scraps, as Renee referred to them. We really like wood chips because they're readily available and free. But sawdust is another great material. And that is adding carbon to that system. So this is creating the conditions for the kinds of bacteria and microorganisms that are breaking down your food waste. And it's also what you need for a healthy soil that you're going to get at the end. So brown, carbon, green, nitrogen, and 2 carbon to 1 nitrogen. So there's lots of different resources out there to describe what this is, but we tend to rely on wood chips and other wood products for that. So
great. So with layering, it's layering browns and greens, and greens. Okay.
Yeah, and I guess 2 to 1 by volume. Like I know you'll see other things that have to do with like, anyway, so volume is what we mean.
Yeah. Just again, this is, you can get really in the weeds on this, but it will be okay.
Don't go crazy.
If you just do it visually, it'll be fine. So
cool. So you don't have to get a scale out and, or,
can.
You definitely can do that. So you can see people will do the chemical breakdown of carbon and nitrogen to get the right ratios. Sure. And if they're doing like a soil product, this is another thing that commercial composters do differently, is that they will control their recipes for the end product. So, but you don't need to do that at home.
Yeah. Great. Awesome. Well, that's all good information to know to get your compost bin going. So if your backyard gardening space is small, the 3-bin system doesn't sound like that would be the best use. So would you recommend the Darth Vader helmet style? Like, can you still compost in a small gardening space?
I would say you can definitely still compost in a small gardening space, but I would look into all of the options possible. We have frustrations with the Darth Vader style because they're hard to get compost out. So I know people who really love a tumbler, for example, and it goes back to what Marion was asking about. How much effort do you feel like putting into it? And what do you want it to aesthetically look like? Like really think through these things. I have friends who literally just have chicken wire around an enclosed space and will dump their food scraps and then dump leaves on top, and and they can see the entire process, but they don't mind having that in their backyard. So take a look at all of the options, and maybe if your friends have some, go look at other ones, see what they like about it, what they don't. because you will have to look at it all the time. What's tough about the Darth Vader style and even the tumblers is that they're a little more anaerobic, which means they might get a little wetter, muckier, stinkier, because it's really enclosed. But it's good to kind of have a sense of what you want to look at in your backyard.
Okay. Yeah. Good to know. And then what if you are in an apartment, so you don't have any outside space? Is there any way to compost in that scenario?
So I have never done vermicomposting or composting with worms in your own underneath your sink, but Marion, you might be able to speak a little more to that.
And this is a little outside. I haven't done this extensively, but vermicomposting is an option for people that are in apartments. It is relatively low odor. And in the spring, Kompost Kids compost piles often have spawning worms, so you are welcome to adopt some of our worms. It is a good option. It's labor intensive relative to cold composting, and so people tend to we frequently receive failed vermiculture bins. So, which is a little bit, we're like, hey, we're sorry about that. We feel bad for the worms, but then, we add them to our compost pile where they find new life as different compost. So it is an option, but it is like any other living thing, that it requires a certain amount of attention and care. And it also can't keep up with a large family. So if you're living in an apartment and there's more than 2 of you, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless you're like really into it. And then the third issue with it is that, as with all composting methods, you have to have an outlet for the finished product. So not having a place to put the finished soil becomes an issue. So,
that's a really good point. Yeah.
So typically is there like keeping things in your freezer? So if you can store up your food scraps and then find somewhere to bring them. So we do have some compost sites that are open to the community. If you look on our website and go under compost sites, we actually share a bunch of other resources. So one is I'm going to say it wrong, Share Waste, I think. Mandi, you know more about this, but your neighbors are opening up their compost bins. So you can likely find something near you to use, or if it's several people in your apartment complex, you might want to consider commercial pickup, which that has expanded in Milwaukee as well. So we give some examples of collection of buckets versus collection of compost, like larger rolly bins, and different places that are doing that for pay service in Milwaukee on our website.
Yeah, that's a really, really good thing to point out, is that, you can make all this compost, but if you don't have the yard to put it in, it might be best to contribute your scraps so someone else can make the compost and use it that way. Yeah. Okay, great. So this, I think, would be along the similar lines. The next question was, how can you compost in a small outside space like a balcony? So seems to be a similar situation, unless you have anything else to add to that one.
It's the same thing. So I have had a vermiculture system and a balcony garden, and those went well together. So if you are actively growing plants to produce your own food, it is actually one way to handle that. But you, again, have to have an outlet for the soil. So.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for confirming that one. And while we're talking about vermicomposting, do you have any tips? We kind of talked about them, but someone specifically was saying their worms can't keep up with their coffee grounds and apple cores. Do you have any thoughts to share there?
Get a bigger bin. You can actually, like the typical, what people either make their own, and they're usually in like a 15-gallon tote, or there's those stacked things that people like to make, and they're actually really small. So you could have more than one system going, and it would, move your worms through them. So it is possible to do that, but make sure you could just take the end product and find an outlet for it somewhere in a community garden or something like that. But having 2 going is certainly a reasonable way to approach it.
Cool. Great, great. Okay, so the last two questions we were going to talk about in this first segment here, they're kind of related. So it's what can you and can't you include in a compost? And you've kind of talked about this, and I know that you have this listed on your website, and I also have this listed on mine, but if you can just briefly touch on what goes in, what doesn't, and then I have some specific items that often raise a few questions to go through.
Great. So if you're following what I'm saying when I say keep it vegan plus eggshells, that includes like coffee grounds and tea leaves and things like that. Like any plant material really is going to be safe for your backyard compost bin. Some people do avoid grains. We take them in the River West compost pile. So some smaller backyard composters choose to avoid grains and things like that. They will break down. Avoid fats, oils, dairy, any animal product, pet waste. So think about things that are going to potentially produce pathogens that you're not going to kill with your composting process, and that aren't going to easily break down outside. So technically, mostly, like I could compost myself in the future. Do you know what I mean? So things will break down. It's just how do you do it safely in your backyard is different than just like throwing something in and hoping for the best. Because it's sort of like I think about like leaves breaking down in the forest. Like think about that level of vegetation, and you wouldn't really want to throw a bone out there, or toss your cheese rind out there. Like that's just going to attract all the wrong sorts of things. So vegan plus eggshells are fine.
Cool. That sounds good. And then yeah, the specific ones of these things have been a little like I've heard it, I've not heard it. So we've already touched on dairy. So dairy is no in a backyard compost, just to keep your composting safe. But what about pet hair?
So I struggle with this, and I think same with human hair. So those are the kinds of things, especially if there's a lot of it, that are really good for nesting things. And so you think about what might want to dig into your compost pile and pull out that pet hair. Do you want them to go in it? And so technically some people do add it, some people don't. I get frustrated when I see large mounds of it in a compost pile. One, because I think it's going to attract things to it that might want it for nesting. So I try to avoid that and ask people to avoid it in River West. But Marion, anything else to add to that?
No, that's a really good point. So we've talked a little bit about the value of layering, and part of that is because you're trying to control pests in this compost pile. So they are always going to be an issue because composting is it relies on living creatures as part of the process of breaking it down. But some of what we limit is to discourage pests, and that's a really good reason not to include hair. It has the potential to create an anaerobic condition in a pile because it tends to mat down. So while in theory it's something that is organic material and would break down eventually, we don't want it in a home or a community compost site. So
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not so much about what's technically going to break down, it's what you actually want around, and what it's going to attract. So that's good. Okay. What about dryer lint and dryer sheets?
Yeah, so dryer sheets are a big no-no. They are massively toxic, first of all. So there's a lot of, and that's actually why I avoid dryer lint too, unless you know, like there's unless you know all of the dyes that are in your clothing are safe, and all of like pretty much everything that's in there. I think about what you're going to use the finished product for. And if there is, say, a lot of clothing dye that's coming out in your lint and it's like capturing a lot of stuff, I think about, do I want to grow food out of that? And so I don't know. It's a tough one because it does break down pretty quickly. So that's, I don't know. Marion, do you have any thoughts on that? Like,
again, you touched on the main reason why we wouldn't accept dryer lint is because the end product is soil for community gardens. And so if you're composting at home, maybe you're not using that compost for growing food, but dryer lint, so some of you may be familiar with the issue of microplastics, and dryer lint is a significant source of that. So most of our clothing today is not made from natural materials, and lint is fundamentally just like probably going to be full of plastics. And we recognize that we can't totally control what's in our compost, but and that microplastics are everywhere. But to the extent possible, we wouldn't want dryer lint because it is basically going to be whatever. If you look at the tag of your shirt, it's going to be 80% polyester or whatever. That's the dryer lint is also therefore 80% polyester. So I don't want to grow food in that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't really want to grow food in that either.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about ashes?
So it depends on like what the ashes are from. So untreated, the no lighter fluid, the wood is fully clean, but I don't know about the ratio. So like that's something that I'd want to actually ask Marion about. If it's a coal briquette, then no. But if it was like a wood burning fire that the wood wasn't treated, there's no paint in there, there's no other kinds of toxins or chemicals, that's a slightly different story.
Right. And again, that's exactly right, which is we have occasionally accepted biochar, so waste from people's wood burning furnaces that has been, we know it's fully broken down, and we know that the material that was in it was very specific. So we've taken that at the demonstration site before, but like from a backyard fire pit, I mean, I know what we do in our backyard fire pit. And I'm not going to try to compost that. So, which is, some of it is that we're burning logs that we've purchased, but also that, there's other things that get into the fire pit. Yeah, and definitely not from a charcoal grill, because those products are petroleum based, and they, apart from that fact, can have a negative impact on the microbiology of a compost site. So no.
Yeah. So almost like err on the side of caution unless you 100% know, it might not be
Right.
worth it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And like this next question seems along the same lines of, you're vacuuming, you've got all the things you've collected, can you put it in the compost? But it's like, what did you just pick up? Yeah.
Right. So if it's like mostly dust, I actually do that in my own house, but I don't bring that to the River West compost pile. I think that could very easily overwhelm, or what Marion earlier was talking about, like if there's hair in it and that can become anaerobic, like things that like mat it down and like trap water seem to get real mucky and gross. So I will do that in my own space, but I wouldn't add that to somebody else's. And then if there's like, so if say somebody was just like doing a bunch of construction, or there's plaster or paint or fiberglass or insulation, obviously anything that has a toxin in it, you want to avoid. So it's, again, if you know that it's mostly, it's going to be probably too hard to parse it out. And what would you want to grow food out of your fiberglass insulation?
Yeah,
sure.
And most carpeting too is, so carpets and homes are made out of synthetic materials. So that it comes, the pet hair thing is its own thing, but it comes back to that question of microplastics. So we know they're everywhere, but to the extent possible, please don't put them in our compost piles.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, or yours.
Yeah.
Unless you're just going to, no, we won't go with what you could do with it, but
Yeah.
dig it in somewhere and then plant a tree.
Right.
But then I don't know if the tree sucks it up and then releases it to the air, because isn't half our microplastic consumption is from the air? So.
Oh goodness.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Yes, we won't go down this road, but
Okay. Yeah. All right. Last question for this segment then is, what about the items that say they're backyard compostable, like the green produce bags that I've seen around? Like, are they? Is that too good to be true?
So we do still take BPI certified, very, very thin compostable plastic bags that, so I know somebody's question was, I've seen this produce bag at Outpost, for example. Those seem to be breaking down fine. One thing to note, if you're going to put them in your own backyard, is they get, it makes it a little more gelatinous, for lack of a better term. We don't get a ton of them compared to all of the volume in River West, so it's doesn't seem to be that big of a deal, but we still do see them in the end product. But I've also seen like tea bags that say backyard compostable safe, and I don't know, I have not seen what that certification actually means. So like when somebody labels dental floss backyard compost safe, like I don't know who's keeping track of that. We know what BPI certification is, and then it's the ASTMI. Is that the other one? So we know
ASTM.
as ASTM. So we know what those are, but it's almost like you'd have to look at every single product that you're talking about, see who's verifying that they're saying it is backyard compostable, and how are they determining that. So it's best to not just like throw it in and wish that it's going to break down safely, because like the term natural, it might truly mean nothing in terms of who is regulating the standards for that. So you got to do a little more digging to say like whether or not that's going to be safe.
No, that's a good point. I didn't know that it's, but yeah, that makes sense. It's the natural, organic, like what do these labels mean? It could just be a fancy label that
I don't know. And I tried to do a little digging yesterday when I saw the question. I'm like, what does that actually mean? And I couldn't find a straight answer right away. And that's something that we might be able to throw out to some of the larger, maybe we add that to like a question for BioCycle or something like that. Because there are large listservs of community compost groups that we communicate with, and that might be something to follow up on. But like you'll see, I think people even get confused about the word biodegradable. Biodegradable does not mean compostable, and it often has plastic in it, or even if you see something like I've seen a bunch of like those coffee pods that have like a hard plastic rim around it. Those will not break down in a garden system, and they might not even be technically commercially compostable and safe. And so there is a lot of misinformation out there, and people use fun words on their, it's greenwashing. People use words on their products to make it feel like it's better to choose, and you really have to do your own due diligence to look further into it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And thank you to you both for helping us decipher some of this information so that we can be better backyard composters. Yeah, thank you both so much. This wraps up our first segment. And thanks so much for submitting your questions. If you still have any other questions, you can check out Kompost Kids website, like they were mentioning. It's compostkids.org. I also have a composting guide on my website, which is hummingbirdmke.com. You're also welcome to reach out to us as well. So please stay tuned for the second segment. We're going to be answering your questions about maintaining a compost and the composting service questions that came up as well. So see you next time. Thank you again.
Thank you.